Nothing happens here. Why? Now I have the left hand. And here he writes 4, and there too, he wants to have the deceptive cadence.
So then really we're looking at an etude which is focused on several different elements of music that all come together rather than just focused on one thing.
You have they're little suspensions or appoggiaturas. Where are they actually? They switch the beat. So I started analyzing and I thought, this is completely interesting. And I thought, how can I practice that? So I went, okay, I need to practice. I started doing silly games, but... And now that's 5, 3. So that I can feel which is... And that's the embodied practice. I want to feel the voice leading with my hand. And now I do little things like this. I think we've moved past everything needs to be about the facts because we're missing out on what music is if we just talk about the facts. So the next step is, how does this make you feel? And then you start talking in metaphors because you cannot talk about it directly. Or if you say, I want to communicate this directly, then you play.
Right, where it's more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
Right, in these discussions.
So if people are interested in that, I think you do research and you find out also there's a whole new area in the US, also in Europe now, that's perception and cognition. How do we process music? And I think musicians have always thought about that.
Sigrun, thank you so much for joining me here in Salzburg. What a wonderful and musical place to discuss what we do.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to have that conversation with you.
So you mentioned a term that I hadn't heard before, and I'm curious to ask about it. Embodied learning, what does that mean?
Well, actually, embodied learning is actually probably what we do every time we learn a skill. Mm-hmm. But for me, I want to create a new movement that I call embodied analysis. So playing an instrument is a physical activity, and you get to know how the body works, and it's that place where your intellect, which actually physical awareness is also in your brain, but we just do that separation, which really doesn't exist. Even if you hear sounds, you have a physical response to them because you imagine, if you think of the mirror neurons, what it would feel like to produce that sound.
Well, this is an interesting juncture for the series because there's a perception that the world of music theory and the study of it, and we can define that in a moment, but that music theory and performance are two separate universes, and one goes into one or the other.
A lot of times I get to analysis from the piano. So there's something I feel in my hands, and then I get curious, and then I take the score and start thinking about it. And for me, analysis is a way of thinking about music, and theory just gave me more tools. Mm-hmm. So when I started with theory and I did Schenkerian analysis, I was so excited because I felt finally someone gave me tools to understand tonal music.
Examining whether the study of the craft and the way things are built, is that taking away from the magic in a way? Is that getting into an intellectual pursuit?
When I play, I communicate in music. When I teach, I communicate about music. But the goal for me is always to deepen the experience. And for me, understanding is actually a deepening of experience because something changes in my awareness. And that change can be a theoretical awareness, which basically just means I have a terminology for something that's happening. It could also be a physical, and often it's both. If you have a harmony change somewhere, you feel it in your body, I can use theory to name that harmony change, but if I don't feel it in my body, it's meaningless.
I'm glad we're defining this because I think maybe a more general audience might think that music theory is about the study of harmony exclusively.
One of the biggest revelations for me was actually the study of meter. We did studies of hypermeter. So if you have a meter, you have beats and you have groupings. And for meter to happen, like if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, I need to have a regular grouping and I need to have a regular accent, or heavy and light, whatever you want to call it. And then I get that kind of groove. If you think of Beethoven Ninth Symphony, the scherzo, written is 3/4. No one can conduct that fast, so you feel the whole bar as the pulse. And then there's this place where he changes back from 3 to 4, and it's totally confusing, and I think he means that. And there's another spot where I usually ask my students where they hear the Schwerpunkt, which is the stress. In the bass would be. If I ask a cellist, they hear. If I ask a violinist, moment. They hear.
So the shifting emphasis is already changing the interpretive possibilities, I sense.
Yes, and depending what instrument you play, you may feel the stress according to the melody, or you may, if you play bass, you feel the stress according to the bass. And then people realize they have different modes of hearing. If you feel the pulse over larger time spans by grouping measures instead of beats, all of a sudden you have that flow. You don't have to think about it. You just decide in a phrase, you look at it and you go, where does the phrase move to? Is it front or end accented? Is the accent of the phrase toward the end, or is it more toward the beginning? Interestingly, there are two main styles. If you think of German and English language, they're front accented. So a lot of German and music from the Anglo-Saxon tradition has the accent or the heaviest part of a phrase at the beginning. If you think of Romanic languages, the stress of a phrase often shifts to the end. But Mendelssohn is an interesting case because with him it changes depending on the piece. So you just look at the melody and say, does it start with a lot of weight and then it lightens up, or is it toward the end of the phrase? And all of a sudden it starts flowing if you find the right solution.
If we're looking at the tradition of jazz, performing or making jazz music, we're talking about these building blocks, these elements of the music. We have the harmony, we have the rhythm, the meter, and the emphasis. Those are the elements of the language that unfold in improvisation. So that is absolutely functional in jazz. What would you say to someone who's playing classical music that has already been written, they would say, well, I don't really need to know about those things?
Some people are great intuitively. They've learned the language through what's called statistical learning. They just know Mozart sounds a certain way. And maybe you have a performance tradition, things are played a certain way. But I feel to really know the language, you have to understand the grammar. And I always tell my students, I don't care what decisions you make, but you have to be able to argue in a convincing way about why you play things a certain way. And you have a certain grammar, and you have conventions. I don't even want to call it rules, but conventions, that a dissonance, if you have a suspension, it tends to be on a stressed beat, and then you relax. If I played, it would be weird, or it would be in a context where it's supposed to be weird.
Yeah.
And if I understand that, I already have tools to find my own interpretation. And I'm not too fond of the word interpretation. I like to replace it with the word understanding. So I have to make the effort to understand what's written there. And I have to get information from musicology, from theory, all the possible information I can get to understand what may be meant in the score. So by the time I get there and I have a certain idea of how I want to play it, that's my understanding of the piece. And then I don't have to apologize for playing a certain way. It's not completely subjective. It's the understanding I developed out of the dialogue with the score.
I know that you've made a huge study and devotion in your life to Ravel. What drew you to the music of Ravel?
I cannot say that Ravel is the music that moves me most deeply. I'm not sure it's meant to be that way. I think Ravel is closer to Mozart in the way the emotions are behind. They're not expressed overtly, but they're there. And the reason I got into Ravel analysis was actually a theoretical reason. I realized that the way you listen to Ravel, sometimes Debussy too, but mostly Ravel, you have passages where you feel kind of floating because you don't have the tonal anchor. You don't know actually where's the tone center. And then all of a sudden there's a cadence, you go, oh, now I know where I'm in again. And there's a beautiful cadence, you go, okay, I hear 4-5-1, I'm in this key. And then you start floating again. And so that whole way of hearing that kind of music started to fascinate me. How can you play at the edge of tonality without going atonal and the tonality is still in the background?
If we're talking about this study of theory and all of these elements as the understanding of how we share music, how would you go about teaching a student a piece? Does it start with the theory? Does it start with playing at the instrument? Is the theory studied away from the instrument? Are there discussions about that in the lesson?
Well, I don't actually teach people at the instrument. I teach them in the classroom in groups. And for the performance majors, I put together a curriculum of analysis tools that seem to me the most fruitful for performers. So the first unit, I actually do something where I borrow from Schenkerian analysis and we do a reduction. So for example, I show them a movement from the Bach E flat major suite. We start like that. And they see 2 pages of non-stop eighth notes. And I ask them, how long do you think it will take you to memorize those 2 pages? And I get answers from everything between 4 hours to 4 weeks. Or some people say, well, depends on how much I practice and so forth. And I say, how about if I taught you a method to reduce the information so you can reliably memorize this in 1 hour? And so I take the first third, which is up to the repeat sign, and we just look at it and say, okay, we can say it's an A prime form, or in US theory, a rounded binary, because we notice that in a certain measure, the beginning comes back. And then we say, okay, we'll focus on the first third. And then we reduce this by saying, okay, there are neighbor notes. And I reduce it just to the main note. And then I have passing notes. And I reduce it. So if I take the first line, so we have reduced the first line. I say, what do you call that? And they say, well, it's an E flat major triad.
Would it be fair to say that this is a form of outlining?
Yeah, I think of it as a reduction. And in the end, basically, you have a harmonic progression. You say first line is tonic, second line alternates between dominant and tonic. Then the tonic becomes the 7th chord. We go to scale degree 5 or Roman 5 to the dominant, because most movements in a suite go to the dominant at the end of the first half. And so what they get in the end is, by talking about it and labeling about it, every detail, every single eighth note gets grouped into beats, they get grouped into lines, and the lines get grouped into a harmonic progression. So even if I have a memory slip as I play, I know where I am and I know what's next. And if I take out the time that it takes to explain this method, you can memorize that first line in about 10 to 20 minutes. And that first third of the piece. I mean, you take a few seconds for a line, you repeat it, and after a while, you know. Okay, so we do it by singing because everybody can sing. You can do it in your memory. You can also do it mentally by imagining you play on the instrument, or you can do it at the instrument. The process is pretty much the same. So to me, it's like the same as practicing, and I use theory for the same purpose. Practicing is reducing complexity so that I can give myself a goal I can achieve.
Who was Schenker, and was Schenker trying to have this as the outcome to make things easier to learn? What was the goal?
He started as a pianist, and he started just analyzing and wondering what goes where. Where is the most tension? What's the progression? Where is the dominant in relation to the tonic? Where are there embellishments? What happens if I reduce the embellishments to understand what's the underlying structure? And some people say that in the end you get, and some people joke about Schenkerian analysis and say it's three blind mice, because if you reduce everything, this is what's left. I don't agree, because the thing that's left is not the point. The process of finding the reduction is the point, because you learn so much about the piece.
And what was the reaction of your students when they started to learn this and maybe to apply it?
They loved it. Pianists then come and say, yeah, well, that's fine. You have one line and it lends itself to reducing quite nicely. And I said, yeah, of course, I pick a piece that works well. But pianists can do the same. Just your reduction then is maybe a harmonic reduction of a polyphonic structure. So, what's that? If I reduce it to two voices. And now I understand that's tonic. There's not much tension, but now. So this is where the harmony changes. Now I'm back to tonic. So it already helps my interpretation because I know where the phrase is going.
Absolutely.
And then all of a sudden I notice the same pattern with different diminutions, which is like playing around the main structure. These third lines are all over that first movement. And that also helps me memorize.
What about learning how to practice? That seems to be somewhat related, but also different.
The first professor I studied with in Stuttgart, Fernande Kayser, she was French-Swiss from Geneva, or the area, and she studied with Lipatti when she was quite young. I think she was a teenager. And I think she was with him for about 5 years, and then he died. I'm not sure about the dates, but approximately. And I think she was his only female student. And she told anecdotes about him. One anecdote I remember, she played the first Chopin etude for him, and at some point she had the right chord but the wrong inversion. Let's say she played an E in the bass instead of a C, or vice versa. And he closed the score and said, "This is the Bible, you don't touch it." And she said that was the end of the lesson. But she was quite strict herself. Sometimes I struggled with that. But it made me grow. For example, we had to play every piece for her from memory. You went into your lesson, you had the piece memorized. And when I started with her, I memorized one movement of sonata, and I was quite proud within a week or so. And she said, "What's with the other movements?" I said, "I haven't learned them yet." And she said, "This is professional. This is not kindergarten." I thought, oh my God, you had to be highly professional. This was a serious business. There was no faking it. You worked hard, but it was always in the service of the music. And there's some teachers who have big egos, great personality, and you feel like they just want to show you that they know all and you know nothing. It wasn't about that. For her, it was always you serve the music. And you give your everything to do it the best you can. So that was part of the Lipatti heritage, and I think also that you had to hear everything. And I still find that, especially now that I studied theory, I want to hear everything. I want to be able to follow the bass and the melody and the inner voices, not, okay, here I play a little upper voice, here I play a little bass. No, everything needs to be present. And that was another thing, I think, that you had to be able to, you for yourself had to hear every note. You couldn't just do that here. So those were the two things that impressed me the most. I still learn how to practice. I know it a lot better now. I think the first rule of practice is be nice to yourself. And I talk to my students about that too, because I suffered a lot because I wasn't nice to myself when I practiced. It's like this idea that you only earn something if it's hard. It doesn't have to be hard. It is hard by itself, but you don't have to make it harder. What worked for me, and I think that's what learning is about, especially in our fast-paced world, is to say, instead of saying, I cannot do that, I say, I cannot do that yet. And that's the biggest difference. So it means I have trust in the process that eventually I'll find a way to get there. It may take a week, it may take years. It doesn't matter. You put yourself in the position that you say, the only thing I can do is to improve and figure out how things work for me. And you have to get to know yourself and see what kind of learner you are. Some people are visual learners, others are haptic learners. Some people learn through theory. When I was a kid, I learned by ear. I actually didn't read music very well. And now I use theory because I can use shortcuts by understanding, let's say there's a sequence. So there's a pattern and it gets repeated, and I just need to learn the pattern and I need to remember, does it go up or down? And so that's 2 bits of information. One is the pattern, the other is the way the pattern moves. And the other advice that I give my students is to not let people judge them as talented or not talented. Because I think the danger is in a university or school like that, there are a few people who are the stars and they get noticed. To me, that's wrong.
Yeah.
Everybody deserves to be supported and nourished. And I don't like distinguishing between talented people and not talented people. The reason I'm saying that is that no one can tell at what point in your life things may come together. Some people come and they develop at a young age. They may have had amazing teachers. They come here, they're fully formed, and maybe their progress is okay, but not how should I say? They move from 150 to 160. And then other people arrive and they're at maybe 10. And they move to 100 in the time they have. Or they struggle for 2 or 3 years and all of a sudden something happens and they realize what they can do. No one can predict that. So it's not about thinking, are you talented or not? To me, it's the dedication. You need to love it enough that you say, I invest a lot of time in getting better, in understanding, in learning.
What would you tell such a student who feels like they're stuck for a long period of time and they're discouraged and maybe think that they have to find another path?
I could have a conversation with them to get to understand where they're stuck. Not every stuck is the same. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you're physically stuck, sometimes you have too much tension, sometimes it's mental. You get confused, sometimes you have just a lifestyle that doesn't help. Sometimes there's psychological problems, you never know, and sometimes it's a mixture. And so when you teach, basically, you need to help people to learn so they can find solutions for themselves. You can offer them solutions and they can try them out, and they may work or they may not work.
You've described your work and practice of music as a search for understanding. Did you ever have in your musical life a moment of understanding that was a complete revelation or completely emotional for you, that you didn't expect, that what you were studying and what you found maybe opened up a new chapter for you?
I don't remember when it was. I just remember the feeling that you're there. It can happen at home. It can happen at a concert. You just become one with the music. You don't think anymore. It's just happening, and that's incredible. And in analysis, it's not as emotional, but it's that moment when you feel, oh, I get what he was doing. Ravel, for example. I finally understand why he wrote it exactly this way, not another way.
Sigrun, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation about music and the elements of why we do it and the joy that we can find in understanding. It's been such a
Thank you.
pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.